It was a cold Friday evening in Riverdale, and the small town was alive with the hum of a weekend. Beginning, the bars were filling up with locals looking to unwind after a long week, and among them sat Michael Gray, slouched in a corner booth of the Rusty Anchor bar, nursing a half-finished beer. He wasn't much for crowds or attention, but tonight felt different. Something hung in the air, as if the night itself was restless. Michael couldn't quite shake the feeling, but he tried to ignore it as he took another sip of his drink. His brother Thomas, the chief of police, always told him to stay out of trouble, but Michael had never been good at listening. Trouble followed him like a shadow from his rebellious teenage years to his adulthood. There was always something, whether it was a bar brawl, a late-night drive through the wrong neighborhood, or the whispered rumors that circulated every time he was spotted anywhere. But tonight, he was just trying to be left alone to relax in the familiar surroundings of the bar. The place was buzzing with chatter and clinking glasses when a man entered the bar, a tall figure in a dark hoodie. His face was partially obscured, but Michael couldn't help but notice the air of danger that seemed to follow him. The man's eyes darted around the room, surveying the crowd, before his gaze locked onto Michael for a brief moment. But it wasn't that moment that would change everything, it was what happened next that would. A loud crash from the back of the bar broke the momentary silence, followed by shouts and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Michael stood up instinctively, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the commotion. The man in the hoodie had just knocked over a display of bottles, causing chaos in the crowded bar. In the confusion, no one saw the man slip out the back door unnoticed. Outside, moments later, a robbery was reported just down the street. At a local convenience store, a masked figure matching the description of the man Michael had just seen entered the store and threatened the cashier before fleeing with the money. Now the police were on the scene looking for the suspect, and there was no one to connect the dots to the scene at the bar, no one but Michael. As the officers responded to the scene at the bar, the description of the suspect was relayed to them: a man of medium build wearing a dark hoodie. The details were vague enough to fit anyone, and no one seemed to question it. Michael had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, his drunken state doing little to help his case. When the officers arrived, they quickly spotted him, and without any hesitation they grabbed him, thinking they had the suspect. Michael protested, but his slurred words were lost in the noise of the officers, telling him to calm down and put his hands behind his back. He didn't even get a chance to explain himself as they handcuffed him and shoved him into the back of the squad car. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into his wrists, and his mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. He had no idea that the mistake they were making was far more significant than he could ever imagine. In the confusion, no one had stopped to think who Michael really was, or who his brother was. The chief of police would soon learn that his own brother had just become the latest victim of a terrible mistake that would shake everything to its core. Thomas Gray had always been the picture of composure, a man whose reputation in Riverdale was built on a lifetime of discipline and respect. But the phone call that night shattered his calm. The voice on the other end of the line was Urgent Officer Reynolds. The one who had made the arrest sounded as though he had just realized the gravity of his mistake. He didn't say it outright, but the tone in his voice left no room for doubt. "Chief Gray, listen, we have a problem. Your brother Michael was arrested for the robbery down on Main Street, and we need you to come down here right away." Thomas felt his heart sink. The name that followed the description of the suspect was one he never expected to hear. His brother Michael arrested for a crime he hadn't committed. For a moment, the room seemed to close in on him, his breath catching in his chest. It didn't make sense. Michael wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a criminal either. He rushed out of the station, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. What had happened? What were the officers thinking? Why hadn't anyone checked more carefully? He arrived at the precinct in record time, his fingers trembling as he grabbed the door handle and swung it open. The officers inside were all too aware of who he was, and they fell silent as he entered. Officer Reynolds looked up nervously, knowing full well that the arrest had been a mistake. The chief's presence filled the room like a thundercloud, but Thomas' eyes immediately found the one person he had hoped not to see. His brother Michael sat slumped on a bench, his hands still cuffed and his eyes bloodshot from the alcohol. Thomas took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He walked over to Michael, his voice low and filled with a quiet anger. "What happened, Mike? What did they say?" Michael looked up slowly, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. "I don't know, Tommy, I swear. I didn't do anything. Some guy started a fight in the bar, and I tried to get away, but they grabbed me and just dragged me out of there, like I was guilty of something." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had been part of the police force for over 20 years, and yet here he was facing the consequences of a mistake that threatened everything he had worked for. His younger brother was in a cell because of a case of mistaken identity, and now his entire career and reputation hung in the balance. After a brief moment of silence, Thomas turned to Officer Reynolds with cold eyes. He didn't need to say much to make it clear that he was furious. Reynolds had made a terrible mistake, and Thomas would make sure it was corrected, but the damage had already been done. Michael's name was already tied to the crime in the eyes of the public. Thomas didn't want to make this worse, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The entire town would soon know about this, and once word spread that the brother of the chief of police had been wrongfully arrested, the fallout would be impossible to contain. The officers quickly began the paperwork to release Michael and clear up the confusion, but Thomas knew that the damage to his family's reputation would take much longer to fix. He looked at Michael again and sighed as he realized that the man sitting before him was no longer just his brother. He was a pawn in a system that had failed them both. The night stretched on as Thomas worked with his officers to smooth over the mess, but inside his mind was consumed with one thought: how could something like this happen? What was it that had gone so wrong? The next morning, the small town of Riverdale buzzed with whispers. Word had spread quickly about the arrest of Michael Gray, the younger brother of the chief of police. People gathered in coffee shops and on street corners, discussing the events of the previous night. Some whispered that Michael had finally crossed the line, while others claimed it was just a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. No one knew for sure what had happened. Of one thing was certain: the Gray name was now at the center of a scandal that no one saw coming. Thomas sat in his office at the police station, his hands pressed against his temples, trying to process everything. The situation felt like it was slipping through his fingers, no matter how hard he tried to hold on. His brother Michael had been arrested under the assumption that he was the robber, a criminal act that seemed so out of character for the man who had always walked on the fringes but never crossed into real danger. And yet here they were. Michael was in the holding cell, caught in a tangled web of mistaken assumptions, and the damage to his own reputation was already taking root. He had spent the entire night sorting through the mess. The initial rush to clear Michael's name was followed by a sinking realization that this wasn't just a personal failure, it was a blow to the entire police department. The officers involved in the arrest, though well-intentioned, had failed to properly assess the situation. They hadn't cross-checked the witness descriptions, and worse, they hadn't questioned whether Michael's presence at the bar could be purely coincidental. A part of Thomas understood the pressure on his officers. They had to act quickly in a high-stakes situation. The robbery had been close by, and the descriptions of the suspect were vague enough to make any man in a hoodie seem like a potential criminal. But another part of him, perhaps the part that had spent years cultivating his position, felt betrayed by the lack of diligence. This wasn't just about his brother. It was about his leadership, his authority, and the trust the people of Riverdale had placed in him. Michael wasn't the only one hurt by this. The entire police force now faced questions about their professionalism. Officers who had been with Thomas for years, men and women he trusted, were now under scrutiny. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, but now the cracks were starting to show. What had gone wrong? Why hadn't anyone stopped to question the situation more thoroughly? Why had Michael, his own flesh and blood, been treated like a common criminal without so much as a second glance? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Chief, we've got the statement from the bar staff and the surveillance footage," Officer Reynolds said, stepping into the room with a stack of papers. He looked sheepish, a contrast to the confident officer Thomas had known for years. "We'll clear up the mistake, Chief. We're doing everything we can to fix this." Thomas nodded but felt no sense of relief. The evidence was there, yes, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage already done. Michael's face, his name, had been dragged through the mud, and Thomas couldn't help but feel responsible, even though it was a mistake born from others' failures. "We need to move quickly," Thomas said, his voice firm but calm. "Get Michael out of here, and let's make sure we take full responsibility for this mistake. It's not just about clearing his name. It's about fixing the damage to this department's credibility. I'm holding you all accountable for the way this was handled. Get this straightened out, and I want a full report on my desk by the end of the day." Reynolds nodded but didn't speak. He knew better than to argue. After Reynolds left, Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the town he'd sworn to protect. The peaceful streets of Riverdale felt distant now, like they were tainted by the very scandal that had started so unexpectedly. He thought about his brother Michael, sitting in the holding cell, his face likely a mix of confusion and anger. The events of the night had thrown everything into disarray, but what hurt Thomas the most was the realization that, despite everything he had done to protect this town, there would be no easy way to make this right. The storm had only just begun. The days that followed the incident felt like an endless cycle of meetings, phone calls, and public apologies. The pressure on Thomas was immense. The town's reputation had been damaged, and his own leadership was now under a microscope. He could hear the whispers, feel the judgment every time he passed someone on the street. The story of Michael's wrongful arrest had become the center of attention, and though it was an honest mistake, the consequences were far-reaching. The town was no longer just questioning Michael's innocence. They were questioning the integrity of the entire police department. Thomas had ordered a thorough investigation into what had gone wrong during the arrest. The officers involved, including Officer Reynolds, were now under scrutiny. Reynolds had only recently joined the department, and though he had shown promise, it was clear he had made a grave error in judgment. The new recruit had acted rashly in identifying Michael as the suspect without taking the necessary steps to verify his involvement. In the chaos of the moment, Reynolds had failed to apply the discipline and caution required in a situation like this. As the investigation into the arrest continued, more cracks began to show. Reynolds had made other questionable decisions in the past, minor mistakes that had been overlooked in the rush to prove himself. But now, with the public eye fixed firmly on the department, those mistakes were being reevaluated. Thomas could no longer afford to be lenient. The situation was a wake-up call for the entire department. It wasn't just Michael who had been hurt, it was the reputation of the police force itself. Meanwhile, Michael's life had become a circus. The media frenzy surrounding the wrongful arrests seemed to have no end. Reporters camped outside his apartment, trying to catch a glimpse of him, hoping for a statement. But Michael had nothing to say. He didn't want to be a symbol, didn't want to be the poster child for police incompetence. All he wanted was to get his life back on track, but the scandal had turned everything upside down. Even the people who had once been his friends now looked at him with suspicion. The whispers, the sidelong glances, they were everywhere. One evening, as Michael sat alone at the local diner, trying to find some sense of normalcy in a world that felt increasingly foreign, he overheard two older men at the table next to him talking about the incident. "You hear about the gray boy?" One of them said. "Arrested for a robbery, no less. And you know who his brother is? The chief of police. How embarrassing." The other man nodded, clearly amused. "I'd be ashamed if it were me. The whole town's talking about it. Everyone's wondering how the police let this happen." Michael's stomach churned. It was like they were speaking about a stranger, someone he didn't recognize. He stood up abruptly, leaving enough cash on the table to cover his meal, and walked out into the cold night air. He had heard enough. Back at his apartment, he sat in silence, staring out of the window at the empty streets. He was used to being misunderstood, to being judged for his past mistakes. But this time, it felt different. The accusations were not just about him. They were about his entire family, about Thomas, and the reputation he had spent years building. The entire town was caught up in a storm that neither he nor his brother had seen coming. Michael wasn't just a casualty of the situation. He was now part of a much larger narrative that was being written by the people around him. That night, after hours of restless thinking, Michael made a decision. He couldn't control the public's perception of him, but he could control how he responded. He wasn't going to let this mistake define him. He wasn't going to let it tear apart his relationship with his brother. If he had learned anything over the years, it was that the road to redemption was never easy, but it was always possible. The next day, he walked into the local community center and asked to speak to the director. It was time to start making things right, one step at a time. Michael knew he had to prove to the world, and to himself, that he was more than the sum of his mistakes. The next few days were a blur for Michael. The weight of the town's judgment felt heavier with each passing hour, but there was something different now, a shift inside him. He had been running from responsibility for years, always taking the easy way out, avoiding the consequences of his actions. But as the whispers in the diner and the eyes that followed him wherever he went gnawed at him, he realized it was time to face the storm. If he wanted to rebuild any shred of respect, he needed to take control of his narrative. When he stepped into the Riverdale Community Center, he didn't know exactly what he was hoping to achieve. It was just that he knew he needed to do something, anything, to make things right. The center had always been a place for outreach, for those in need, for people looking to rebuild their lives, and in that moment, Michael saw it as his chance for redemption. The director, a woman named Carla West, greeted him with a wary but welcoming smile. She had known Michael for years, had watched him grow up in Riverdale, and had seen him come and go from the shadows of the town. But she also knew the man he could be if he stopped running from his past. "Michael, what brings you here today?" she asked, her voice soft yet direct. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start, but then he said it. "I need to do something. Anything to make up for the mess I've caused. The town's turned its back on me, and I don't blame them. But I can't just hide away. I want to help. I want to give back. I want to prove I'm more than the mistakes I've made." Carla studied him for a moment, taking in the sincerity in his eyes. She could see that this wasn't the same man who had stumbled into the bar that night. This was someone different, someone who was ready to face the consequences of his past actions. "You know, Michael," she said slowly, "this is the first time I've heard you say something like that. I'll be honest, people in this town have written you off, but they forget redemption isn't about fixing everything overnight. It's about showing up, day after day, and proving you've changed." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The town would need more than just a few good deeds to forgive him. He'd have to earn back their trust, piece by piece. Carla stood up, motioning for him to follow her. "There's always work to be done here, especially with the kids. We could use a volunteer for the after-school program, someone to mentor them, help them stay on the right path. If you're serious about making things right, this is a good place to start." As Michael spent the next few weeks at the community center, he threw himself into the work. He mentored the kids, helped with the after-school tutoring program, and assisted in organizing events for the elderly. His hands were busy, and his heart, for the first time in years, felt lighter. Every time he spoke to one of the kids or helped an elderly woman across the street, he felt a small shift within himself, a small step toward redemption. But there was more to it than that. Michael had to find a way to make peace with his brother. Thomas had been his protector, his anchor, for as long as he could remember. Yet now their relationship felt fragile, strained by the weight of the scandal and the anger Michael had seen in Thomas's eyes the night of his arrest. One evening, Michael made his way to the police station after his shift at the community center. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to make things right with his brother. When he walked into the station, Thomas was sitting at his desk, going over paperwork. The moment he saw Michael, the tension in the room became palpable. Neither of them spoke for a few moments, the weight of everything hanging between them. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Tommy, for everything. I've been an idiot, and I'm sorry I've made your life harder." Thomas looked up, his face a mix of frustration and sadness, but underneath it all, there was something else, a quiet relief. He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. "You've always been a pain in my ass, Mike," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But I know you. You're not a bad guy. Just lost." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I'd spent too much time running from things. I don't want to do that anymore." They stood in silence for a moment, And then Thomas sighed. It's going to take time, you know. The town, the department, me, they'll all need time to forgive. But that's up to you. Michael swallowed hard. I'll earn it, Tommy. I'll earn it. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then stood up and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. Then let's get to work, he said quietly. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of effort, and though the road to redemption was long, Michael began to feel the first flickers of hope. The community center had become his sanctuary, a place where his past mistakes were not constantly thrown in his face. The kids he mentored were full of energy and hope, and their laughter and energy helped him forget, if only for a moment, the weight of the judgment from his past. He began to care about them, truly care, something he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. Still, no matter how many hours he spent giving back, there was one thing that always lingered in the back of his mind: the town's reaction to him, especially from the people who had once been his closest friends. There was no escaping the whispers, no ignoring the curious glances. Some had accepted his change, seeing the man who was working to make amends. But others remained unconvinced, unwilling to let go of the image of the irresponsible troublemaker that had followed him for so long. At the same time, Thomas was trying to repair the fractures that had opened within the police department. The scandal had shaken the force, and though Michael's wrongful arrest had been cleared up, the tarnish on the department's reputation remained. Officer Reynolds, the young officer who had made the arrest, had been placed on probation, and the department was conducting an internal review to ensure such a mistake would never happen again. It was a delicate balance for Thomas, trying to rebuild his brother's reputation while also maintaining the integrity of the force. The pressure weighed heavily on him. One day, Thomas called Michael into his office. Michael had been working at the community center all morning, but there was a certain tension in his brother's voice that made him uneasy. When he walked into the station, Thomas was standing by the window, looking out over the town. "You wanted to see me?" Michael asked, keeping his tone light, though he could tell something was on Thomas' mind. Thomas turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, Mike, come on in. Have a seat." Michael sat down across from him, sensing the gravity in the air. Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. "There's been an investigation into Reynolds. It's not just about the mistake he made with you. There have been other incidents. It's clear he's not cut out for this job," Thomas said, rubbing his temple. "I need to make a decision, Mike. He's either going to be let go, or I'll have to keep him on probation, and that could make things worse for the whole department." Michael stared at his brother, his heart sinking. He hadn't realized how much this situation had weighed on Thomas. The young officer had made a mistake, but the ripple effect had extended far beyond that one incident. It had become a test of Thomas's leadership, and now he was stuck with a difficult choice. "What are you going to do?" Michael asked quietly. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, sitting down at his desk. "I'm just trying to figure out if I can trust him again. If the town's going to take me seriously, I need to make the right call." Michael leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. He knew that his brother was trying to do what was best for the department, but he also knew that the weight of the situation could break anyone, even Thomas. The pressure on him was immense. What if you gave him another chance, but made it clear that there's no room for mistakes after this? Michael asked, surprising himself with his own suggestion. Maybe he needs more time, more guidance. You always say people can change if they're willing to put in the work. Thomas looked at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if weighing the idea. Then he nodded slowly. "You know, I hadn't thought about it that way. Maybe I've been too hard on him. He's young, but this is a chance for him to learn. I'll have to be firm, but maybe I can give him another shot." Michael sat quietly, letting the conversation sink in. He had come to the realization that the path to redemption wasn't just about him. It was about everyone involved: the police department, the people of Riverdale, even Officer Reynolds. Everyone had their part to play in the process of moving forward, and everyone deserved a chance to make things right. The two brothers sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared responsibility hanging between them. Michael had no illusions that things would be easy, but he also knew that this was the first time in a long while that he and Thomas were truly on the same page. For the first time, the world outside felt a little less heavy, a little less judgmental. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Before Michael left the office, he turned to Thomas with a small but genuine smile. You know, Tommy, maybe we've both got a little work to do. Thomas smirked and shook his head, a rare smile breaking through. Maybe, Mike, but we'll figure it out together. And for the first time in a long while, the two brothers felt the weight of their past mistakes lifting, replaced by the quiet certainty that they could move forward together and with a chance at redemption. The weeks following that conversation marked a turning point for both Michael and Thomas. The changes weren't dramatic, but they were undeniable. Slowly, the town began to see that Michael was making a genuine effort to turn his life around. He continued volunteering at the community center, mentoring the kids and helping with local events. His interactions with the residents of Riverdale became more thoughtful, and though not everyone was ready to forgive him, the cold stares and harsh whispers lessened. Thomas, too, had managed to restore some of his standing within the police department. Officer Reynolds, now under careful watch, was given a second chance, with clear boundaries and a probationary period. The young officer worked tirelessly to prove himself, and though it wasn't easy, Thomas found that his faith in him had been restored. It wasn't about making the perfect decision, it was about showing leadership, and sometimes that meant offering redemption, even when it felt risky. As the days turned into months, the brothers found a new rhythm in their lives. Michael, who had once felt completely alienated from his family due to his troubled past, began to rebuild his relationship with Thomas. There were still moments of tension, but their connection had deepened. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he was not just the bad brother of the chief of police, but someone who was truly contributing, truly trying to make things right. One evening, as Michael finished up another long day at the community center, he received a call from his brother. The sound of Thomas's voice on the other end of the line was steady, but there was something different in it, a sense of pride that Michael hadn't heard before. "Mike, I need to talk to you. There's something important I want to tell you," Thomas said, his tone carrying a weight that made Michael's heart skip a beat. "Sure. What's up?" Michael asked, trying to keep the conversation light despite the growing sense of anticipation in his chest. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about the mistakes, the way things went down, and about how you've turned it around. I know it hasn't been easy for you, but I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. You've shown me something I didn't expect." Michael was silent for a moment, the words washing over him like a gentle wave. It wasn't just the acknowledgement of his efforts. It was the recognition from Thomas, his older brother, the one person he had always felt he could never live up to. In that moment, Michael felt seen in a way he hadn't in years. "Thanks, Tommy. That means more to me than you know," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without your support. You've always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it." Thomas let out a deep breath, his tone softening. "We've both made mistakes, Mike. We're not perfect, but we're family, and I believe in you. I just want you to keep going, keep doing what you're doing." A warm silence settled between them, a silence that spoke volumes. The road ahead would still have challenges, and Michael knew that, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking it with his brother, not in the shadow of his past mistakes, but side by side, both of them ready to face whatever came next. The following week, Thomas invited Michael to a town meeting. It wasn't just any meeting. It was a gathering of community leaders and local officials, and for the first time, Michael was asked to speak. The room was packed, and when his name was called, there was an almost palpable pause in the air. Michael knew this was his moment to make a statement, not just about his own redemption, but about the importance of second chances for everyone, regardless of their past. He stood at the podium, took a deep breath, and spoke from the heart. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. Some of them were big, some of them small, but they've all shaped me into the person I am today. I'm not perfect, but I'm working hard to be better. And I want this town to know that I'm not giving up. I'm not running away anymore. I'm here, and I'm going to keep working to earn your trust." The crowd listened in silence, and when he finished, there was a moment of stillness before applause filled the room. It wasn't a grandstanding speech or an attempt to win favor. It was raw honesty. Michael had never been more vulnerable in his life, But in that vulnerability, he had found something powerful: acceptance, not from the town, but from himself. That night, as Michael left the meeting, he saw his brother waiting for him outside. Thomas gave him a small, approving nod, and Michael knew then that the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Together, they had faced the storm, and together, they would keep moving forward, building a future they could both be proud of. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope.